Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're here. My name is Sarah Barron. I'm the Dean of the Library, and I want to welcome you to Regent University and to the library. Libraries all around the country just concluded National Library Week. It's a celebration for academic libraries, public libraries, school libraries, and the theme was You Belong at your library. And I found out about 30 minutes ago that we had some law students spending the night in the library. So they're taking that way too seriously, the whole you belong at the library. But anyway, as we wrap up National Library Week, one of the things we love to do here is celebrate faculty publications and faculty research. So tonight we are doing that, and we're celebrating the recent publication of Celluloid sermons. The event, you should have a program. We'll begin with an opening prayer from our Executive Vice President, Dr. Paul Bonicelli, and then Dean Mitch Land from the School of Communication and the Arts will introduce our authors, and then the authors will come up and make their remarks. Following their remarks, we will have a reception, including some tours of the fourth floor film library. We have 5,000 16-millimeter films, many of which represent the history of Christianity. So we would love to show you those as well if you're interested. But for starters, let me turn it over to Dr. Paul Bonicelli.
Thank you. In the original invitation, it said opening prayer and welcoming remarks, and so I will have them. It just says opening prayer here. I did want to say some things. This is a lot of fun for me because of these two gentlemen who were here 25 years ago when I was a student, a government student in the public policy at that time, and it was the newly formed, the newest school at that time. And I have been having deja vu moments for the last 9 months. I just came back 9 months ago to be executive vice president, for those who don't know. And most of those moments had dissipated, but now they're back again because you two are here and we're talking about this, and we're in this part of the library, which I don't think we ever went in and did anything fun like this back then. And when I was a government student, the only other school that was really got my notice was the communication school for things like this and what these two gentlemen did. And so I'm grateful to be back here to see them celebrate this book. In my reading of it, I was thinking, Andrew and I talked about it first, and as I began to read, I started thinking, this is stuff my mom has always said to me about Hollywood because of her age. She's 80 now, and Gone with the Wind was a big deal to her in all of these movies, and she would always talk about remembering what Hollywood was like, and I would think that half of that was made up, and now Andrew has proved her correct, and Terry too. So I've been very interested in the book, and as Sarah said, for the accomplishment for this university and to celebrate it this way, I'm very grateful for. So let me offer thanks for this evening. Father, thank you for Regent University, and this being one of the many things that it means to this world that you have made, that you love, that you will redeem. I thank you that it's done this way by Christians who are involved in this profession and in the study of these things in this discipline. I thank you for Terry and for Andrew and for everybody who was of support to them in creating this book, Celluloid Sermons. Father, I pray that you would bless it to the use of your kingdom and the expansion of your glory. In Christ's name, amen. Oh, and now I will introduce Dean Land. Dr. Land, Mitch Land, is joining me in your 10th month, and I'm in my 9th. You just beat me to speak to you this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. What a joy to be here to welcome all of you. Thank you for coming out because we're very proud of these two, especially with this book. And this is not the end of it, and I'm sure they'll speak more about that. I do want to recognize Terry Lindvall. Thank you, Dr. Lindvall, for coming here tonight and coming back. Dr. Lindvall is the C.S. Lewis Chair of Communication and Christian Thought at Virginia Wesleyan College in Norfolk, or should I say Norfolk, Virginia. Yesterday coming in from Atlanta, she kept saying Norfolk. And if your flight to Norfolk, and I say, doesn't she know it's Norfolk? It's Norfolk. Anyway, previously, Terry taught at Duke University's Divinity School and was the Walter Mason Fellow of Religious Studies at the College of William and Mary. He's the former president of Regent University, where he was professor of film and communication in the arts and held the distinguished chair of visual communication. He's author of Sanctuary Cinema, Origins of the Christian Film Industry, New York University Press, published in 2007. The Mother of All Laughter, Sarah and the Genesis of Comedy, The Silence of God, Silents, Selected Issues and Documents in Silent American Film and Religion, 1908 to 1926, among many, 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 many other works. I just learned also that he's just been named a Fulbright Scholar, not the first time. Which country? To Edinburgh, Scotland. Isn't that wonderful? Congratulations. This is great. We have another Fulbright Fellow in Bill Brown here, so I have to brag a little bit about the School of Communication and the Arts again. Of course, we're also very proud of our own professor, Andrew Quicke, who teaches in the Department of Cinema Television at Regent University. And you're gonna, if you don't know Andrew yet or have heard from him, you're gonna very much enjoy hearing a posh British accent. He'll regale you with that. He specializes in redemptive cinema, the history of contemporary American cinema, foreign cinema, writing for short films and television. He's the author of several books, most recently with Andrew Laszlo, Every Frame a Rembrandt, The Art and Practice of Cinematography. Professor Quicke's professional career in national and international cinema spanned more than 4 decades. Past roles include writing, directing, producing for the BBC, Vice President of Programming for Clearview International Cable Television in Bangkok, Thailand, News Bureau Chief for CBN News and Middle Eastern Television, Jerusalem and Beirut being the locations, President of the Kensington Film Festival Services in London, founder and executive producer of Reuters Viz News International Film Training School, and at Regent he teaches courses on aesthetics, techniques of cinema television, advanced motion picture production, redemptive cinema, history of contemporary American cinema, critical studies, foreign cinema, and writing for film and television. Take a breath. We are so blessed to have this man of God, these men of God, who are also prominent scholars. We are so blessed. Our students are blessed, and we are so grateful to have you tonight. Thank you, my fellow colleagues, for coming tonight. And I want to recognize both of you to come up now and take us on this journey. And if you don't have the book, get the book. It's over there. They'll sign it for you.
We'll charge you for it. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Terry Lindvall, as has been mentioned. And Andrew, you can stand up here with me. We can talk together. I think it's better. This, before I begin, there are a couple people I really need to thank, and it's the librarian staff. The librarian staff have been just so dear to me over the last 30 years. And Bob kind of started a lot of this, and then Donald Gantz came and really put the collection together. And it used to be that in 1979, Andrew and I first met when he came with a group of British scholars and filmmakers, Norman Stone among others. And he came and he started talking to us, and when we started talking back, he fell asleep. Things had not changed with Andrew, but we had this kind of common vision to look at the films that were so bad, but still had an impact on us. And so we started teaching courses in Christian cinema, and this goes back, and Joe Kikasola was one of our first students down here, and he did a lot of the research that we have now exploited and are making money off of. So thank you, Joe, very much. Yeah, but we met, and our conversations were not so much how could we make good films, but what are the films that have been made? We have an interest in the past of finding out what people have done. And one of the things that I first did was we both went to the Library of Congress, to the belly of the Congress there, and started looking at all the old periodicals and reading kind of old literature. And then we found locally some churches like Christ St. Luke's down in Norfolk. I went and I began to kind of explore there and went to the top floor, and I found a 1919 film projector. They used to project films in the sanctuary. So all of this stuff of projecting hymns is nothing new. It goes back a long time. But Andrew and I started talking about these films and looking to say, what has been done in the past? And how do we bring church history and film history together?
So, I don't know if this is live. We'll swap.
This is dead.
First, I really want to thank Dean Sarah Barron, who's really been very supportive in all this, and also to give credit to our Special Archivist Coordinator, Robert Sivigny, and to Special Archivist Assistant Donald Gantz. If they hadn't been around, we'd never have managed to get the lists and sort who made what, and it brought it all together. Now, it's really remarkable that Regent University had the forethought to pay the shipping as various Christian film libraries collapsed, and I would call them up and say, what are you going to do with all those reels of film that you've got? And they would say, well, we're going to put them in the dumpster. And I said, oh, don't do that. What would be much better is if you took a tax rebate, and we'll collect them. We'll send a truck. Now, a library is a precious place, and Regent's Library is precious to us in many ways. Ellery Channing said, books, and I would say films, are the true levelers. They give to all who will faithfully use them the society, the spiritual presence, the best and greatest of our race. James Russell Lowell said, books are the bees which carry the quickening pollen from one to another mind. And I think that's very true of film. And Thomas Jefferson, who said, I can't live without books. Today, we can't live without film. We can't live without the internet. So let's talk about film. Let's recognize that besides well-publicized Hollywood productions, there are many other kinds of film being made. And Terry came up with this very much in his first book. There are underground films, there are political films, there are experimental films, educational films, documentary films. All of these films made outside Hollywood and usually shown in clubs, schools, colleges, churches, but not your local multiplex. So Terry's definition, and mine too, is that these films are films of, by, and for the people of the church, not aspiring to high aesthetic values, nor aiming for economic profit, but seeking to renew, uplift, and propagate. They are, you could say, tribal films, told and retold within their own community to carry on its traditions and its values. And one of the things we discovered was how many denominational films have been made. The makers of these films go against the grain of mere entertainment. They're there to produce a genre of religious cinema that's actually quite markedly political. Political because it subverts the secular city by envisioning, however inartistically and superficially, the city of God. Christian painting and sculpture was created not to draw attention to the artists and craftsmen who made them, but to draw spectators into worship. So Christian films have been crafted primarily to preach rather than to entertain, to emphasize moral and religious concerns rather than aesthetic delights. Christian filmmakers see themselves as struggling to be in the world, but not of the world. That dilemma is the same faced by the church father Tertullian, namely, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church? Poor Jerome experienced a vision of divine judgment when he was condemned as being more of a Ciceronian than a Christian. And as Terry amusingly records in his book, George Lucas has this dream that he's standing before the Almighty, who looked down and said, George, you blew it. So who are the theologians who support the Christian filmmaker? All right, it's good to see the Dean of Divinity here. Liberal theologian Gustavo Gutierrez laid the biblical groundwork for a culture of resistance for those people who want to write their own poetry, design their own artistic works, and speak boldly about what they saw was good, true, and right. His book, Drink from Our Own Wells, tells us not to drink from the poisonous values of multinational corporations with their shiny, commodified culture, a culture of consumption by an undiscerning audience. His concern was for marginalized and exploited people, for their need for dignity and justice. He called for a true and passionate prophetic voice to organize a spiritual resistance to a deeply insidious consumerist culture. So while early Christian filmmakers held beliefs, values, and priorities very different from their secular counterparts, they in fact did not separate themselves from the American entertainment tradition. They didn't campaign against capitalism, but warned about the 7 deadly sins, campaigned for and even against prohibition, and made direct appeals for salvation. Yes, they were preaching to the choir, but their strengths deserve to be recognized. Evangelical propaganda, yes. Historical instruction, yes. Moral edification, yes. Drawing in converts for emotionally and spiritually resonant film. So how do we define the limits of our study? We don't include all those wonderful films which inspire, educate, and mold films, which would just mold minds, which have made the subject far too big. So we define Christian films as films made by Christians fought with a particular goal in mind that relates to the work and ministry of the church or religious community. So we have to leave out films like Sparrows, The Passion of Joan of Arc, Jesus of Montreal. The first book, as I've said, is Terry's Sanctuary Cinema. Sanctuary Cinema was from the very early days of silent film in 1898 right up to 1927. And when 1927 came along, then we had the advent of sound, and suddenly the silent 35mm projectors that so many churches owned became obsolete, and it wasn't easy to project sound film in churches, and it was going to cost a lot of money. So at that point, Christian filmmaking stopped. Our book picks up the story in 1930, when very slowly some people made experimental 16mm films. What had happened was that the industry had got a cheaper variant, a better miles per gallon version, the 16mm film, which is half the width of 35mm film, and which could have an optical soundtrack added to it. Technology advances in leaps and bounds, but sometimes it stops. And in the 30s, 16mm film for silent home movies was common, but it didn't really leap forward until the war. And when the war came, there was a vital need for Uncle Sam to teach the many new people learning to fire weapons in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. And so 16mm got an enormous shot in the arm. A lot of instruction was done through 16mm. And at the end of the war, Uncle Sam wanted to get rid of all his projectors. They were being sold off. And two very enterprising pioneer Christian filmmakers, Jim Friedrich and Carlos Batista, were quite prepared to give projectors, which they'd got very cheap, from the army to churches if they would show the films that Jim Friedrich of Cathedral Films and Carlos Batista made. So it sort of happened in a way because of the war. This enormously expanded during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, so that churches regularly had evening shows. Now, I see Donald sitting there by the projector, which has on it one of the very first, 1939. It's crude, it's poorly made, but just a flash of it will give you a taste of The Story of the Fountain Pen by Carlos Batista. And of course, it's black and white. I don't know if we can dip that. I think we can't dip the lights because all the lights go off. It was pretty solemn. I think that's enough of that one. I think we don't want to watch the whole film. Whatever Carlos Batista failed to do, Friedrich was a good deal more sophisticated. Carlos Batista believed that the message was everything, and you could have amateur cameramen and shoot at night with lights you'd borrowed from the street somewhere. But Jim Friedrich actually made his films in the same studio, the Selznick Studios, where they made Gone with the Wind, and he was very much more professional. Sadly, we were going through the collection. We found that his films have somewhat faded, and we didn't think we'd show them. But we have got a beautiful color film. Now, I need to put in a plug here. The library owns a few 16mm color films, and if they were made in the very early times, the Technicolor dye process, that's wonderful. That will survive for many years to come. But those that were shot on Ektachrome and Eastman color, the Kodak company did wonderfully at the time. Nearly all of their films are fading very fast. And thanks to Dr. Lindvall, we have a wonderful collection of color animation films, some the only copies that we know of in the world. And these are fading. We urgently need a grant to preserve these films by copying them onto a more permanent sort of medium than color film. But the black and white films are going to last quite well. So have a look at the film which I think I saw this first in 1947. It's called The Miracle of Creation by Dr. Irwin Moon of the Moody Institute of Science. And you've got the titles and you get the sort of feeling of it. Any sound? Ah, yes. Interesting thing that these were shown extensively to the armed forces. There was a more secular version of most of them, long before Disney did science and nature films.
We're going to explore several different We think of the stars as little points of light that we see only at night. But our sun is a star. To us, it doesn't look like the other stars in the sky, but that's just because we're so much closer to it than to any of the others. The reason our Earth is so close to the sun is that it's one of the sun's family. That is, one of the 9 planets that revolve around the sun and make up what we call the solar system. But that sun, just how large is it? Well, if it were hollow, you could drop more than 1 million spheres the size of our Earth down inside and rattle them around. But the sun is about 1,500,000 times
Okay.
larger than our Earth.
Very good. Well, you get the idea. It's dated now, but at the time it was pretty revolutionary. Thank you, Donald. I think we'll switch it off. Celluloid Sermons also records the growth of denominational films, the rise and fall of the biggest of all Christian film companies, Billy Graham's Worldwide Pictures, and what grew up during the 50s, 60s, and 70s was a network of 86 Christian film libraries which rented films for churches. They had Saturday night film shows and Sunday night film shows, and in the days when lots of churches had Sunday evening meetings, these all went well. But renting a film could be from $50 to $150, which was quite a lot in the 80s. And then came the technological revolution of the video cassette, and suddenly you could produce cheap copies on video, and many a minister decided they wouldn't spend the money to rent from the big Christian film libraries. They'd send Jimmy down to the local Blockbusters and get a video, which probably wasn't so suitable, but it was cheap. So the film libraries collapsed. By the 80s, they were in bad state. And when I arrived in the United States in 1986, I was fascinated because we didn't have these film libraries in Britain. At that point, when I heard they were going bust, I had a simple technique, which was to call them up and say, what are you going to do with the films now you can't rent them? And they would say, dump them, and I would say, send them to us. And there was one... Or you would drive out there, right? Oh, no, yes, in California I actually went out then. There was one splendid occasion. There was a lady of 76 who said, they're in the storage somewhere. And there was no lighting, and we finally dug out of this sort of storage area something like 100 films, which is spread out in the hot Californian sunlight. And then the owners of the store said, we want to close. And so I raced off and got a U-Haul and filled it up. There was quite a lot of hard labor in obtaining these. But the best thing was, I think, to see Donald Gansey's face when a large truckload arrived from California full of hundreds and hundreds of rusty tin cans with films inside them.
Before our doctoral program, we consign our students to do extra.
That's right. It was the salt mines, yes. So what next? Well, the Christian film industry has been reborn, partly of theatrical releases of apocalyptic films like Left Behind, and of course of Mel Gibson's unforgettable Passion of the Christ. Both Sony and Fox have departments distributing faith and family films. Walden Media has done a great job with the Narnia books. There will be a third volume which will be called Christian Box Office, and we're working on that now. So, any questions? And it's time for Terry to have another go.
That's good. We'll take questions, but a couple things. We began to find films that have a wide range, and what this did for us, we began to find people behind the films. And for example, Jim Fredericks, who was the man who did neither of these, but he started the Christian film industry in 1939. He was an Episcopal priest out of Virginia Union Seminary, and his thesis was the life of Paul. He did a whole series on the life of Paul. I remember as a teenager in high school going on Sunday nights to church to watch these black and white serials of Paul. And they would be very exciting for us because at the end you would have this moment where he was going to be captured by the Judaizers or the Jews, and he was let down out of Damascus, out of a basket, and you had to wait till next week to find out what happened to him. And so these serials were very kind of compelling for us as young kids. But we found Jim Fredericks' son living up in an island off of Vancouver. And so we had interviews with him. We found out other people like Rolf Forsberg is an amazing Lutheran filmmaker who did a 1960 World's Fair film called The Parable. The Parable is about a clown who comes, and it's a parable of Jesus. This is before Godspell. It was controversial. I mean, just really kind of racked the whole church. They didn't know what to do with it. We found him. And finding him, no one had found him for years. In fact, people were blogging, what happened to Rolf Forsberg, is he dead? And we found him alive, we interviewed him, we got just lots of material from him, his films and everything else. So this was the whole process of going and doing historical research and finding genuine sources was, I think, one of the most exciting things. Andrew would go and spend times in saunas with filmmakers, Billy Zioli, the friend of President Ford. And we won't go into some of the details of what happened in the sauna, but he found a lot of really interesting information about it. But we had find just rare films and some films you know. I mean, Thief in the Night and Hiding Place. Great films like that, well, good and bad films like that. And then that great Episcopal film, The Story the Keg Told. It's a story what happens when you drink too much. It's a good Episcopal film. But we found a lot of these films, and we found the stories behind the films. And I think that's what really made it interesting, is that saints, so many saints of the past have put their lives into expressing themselves through celluloid. And very much we are inarticulate in the ways we communicate with the world. And so nothing has changed. But we learn from them. We learn from the past, and it gives us a humility in what we're doing. We end the book in 1986, because in 1986, Regent had won 2 Student Academy Awards against NYU, against UCLA, USC, and so we had kind of reached really a kind of a high point of the film program. When we went there and the films went out there, and they were Christian films that were more of parables than didactic teaching films or knocking you over the head. So we learned how to tell another form of communication. But it really was the two of us sitting around talking, arguing, eating, drinking, and looking for things. In fact, one of my great memories is when we went up to the Virginia State Library, and they were getting rid of all of their 16mm films.
Yes.
And we got about 1,500 films for $1 a piece that we bought. And these were some of the animated films that nobody else has, from Yugoslavia, from Japan, and other places. And we collected them all. Andrew and I, just the two of us, putting all these films in, and we were in shape in those days.
Oh,
That
yes,
was
it was
20
rolling.
years ago. Yeah,
And you should have seen the minivan. It was like we did 2 trips. By the way, I should say that there's something very exciting there. That is the Miracle Projector that was manufactured by Carlos Batista, as long as making films. He made this projector, and the guarantee was that this projector would work until Christ returns. I was a little nervous.
It still works. It still works.
I think it still
But
works.
it's going faulty right now.
I didn't want to spoil the evening by turning it on.
But we'll take this time if there are any questions. So, Chris, good to see you.
Did you, I didn't read, I saw you cover a man called Peter, and I was just going to tell you today a blog came out from a friend of ours who's suffering from cancer, and she used this film, watched it again, as a template to help her think through suffering. And it was Peter Marshall's story,
Yes.
of course, and Catherine's
Catherine.
account of that. But that film, by that Scottish, that was a remarkable film.
I think it's in the index, is it? I hope it's in the index.
The other thing is, you don't realize how many of these films have had a tremendous impact on people.
Yeah.
No matter how badly or poorly made they are, they have still reached people, changed people, and turned their lives around. And so God has used everything to kind of further his kingdom.
Diasaga is a great example.
Oh, yes, yes.
We're recording, so will you repeat the question before you answer it? If you can.
Okay, we will, yes. More questions?
Yeah, Andrew, who financed most of these films? Were they churches? Were they individuals? Were they a combination of those things?
Usually, I think the churches financed them. The Baptists certainly put a lot of money into films up until 1960, and then they had the Radio and Television Commission that put less money into film. Methodists financed theirs. Episcopals tended to cooperate with Lutherans and Presbyterians, and they would have films that fitted all 3 denominations.
We have to acknowledge, too, that the book is dedicated to Tim and Lisa Robertson. They are the ones who gave us an endowment back in 1984, or no, 97, 93, 94, 7, somewhere in there. They gave us but they gave us a significant amount, over $1.5 million, $1.5 million, yeah, $1,500,000. So we were able to make films off of the interest. So we are so grateful for Tim and Lisa, because they're the ones who have really enabled this whole program to go.
Absolutely. Yes, Dr. Weinstein.
Those within denominations who were critical of this or negative about it or said don't do it, who were they and what was their rationale?
We have looked at the kind of the modernist fundamentalist split that happened in the 20s. And with that, Hollywood was going through its own scandals, the Fatty Arbuckle scandal and several others. And so there were many people who were very leery of the Hollywood product. And so then they were leery of film itself. There was also in the 20s the invention of radio. And radio was more suited to preachers who like to talk a lot than filmmakers and artists who like to tell stories through parables. And so radio became the medium of choice. And so all through the 30s and 40s, the church kind of backed away. And it wasn't until the 40s when Jim Fredericks and others brought film back into the church basement because they were trying to keep the youth. How do you keep the youth in? And this becomes a challenge for every generation. How do you bring them into the church? And films, they thought, was the way to do it.
Yes.
Did y'all find a copy of the Ten Commandments, the silent picture of the Ten Commandments?
Oh, it's been around for a long time.
You saw it, because we used it, I actually used that in Africa in the jungle showing film in black and white.
That comes slightly outside our definition because it wasn't specifically made for Christian audiences. But yes, it's been used very widely. Ben.
I saw films by Mel White, and as I recall, they were funny. There was comedy. But I can't think of very many films. Was there much comedy in Christian films in the early days?
Well, Terry can speak bestly to the Charlie Churchman was a hilarious series, a sort of Chaplin in black and white.
Yeah, Mel White, as you know, was your advisor in seminary. He also helped Pat write his book.
And then he came out.
So there were a lot of things, and I think he used to be in the saunas with other
Yeah.
filmmakers.
I was never there.
That's another story. He, just a brilliant man, but his films were hilarious, and I think he worked with Youth for Christ and Young Life, Campus Crusade, and began to make films based on Charlie Chaplin. And so his Charlie Churchman films are just hilarious. They're fun. Now, there were some other satires. Joe Bailey did The Gospel Blimp. And the Gospel Blimp is this great airship that comes, and the people decide the best way to evangelize is to drop gospel bombs on people. So you're pumping out the music and dropping the bombs and just kind of destroying people. So there were a few filmmakers who were mocking themselves and their whole tendency.
Yes.
You looked at thousands of films. Did you have 3 or 4 favorites? And would any of them be popular today?
You know, I think things have changed enormously. I like Jim Friedrich's films very much. They're serious, they're well done. They don't invent a lot of extra non-gospel material. But I think students are just bored by them today. Although we do film research, and we had one person who did a wonderful comparison between Friedrich and Batista, I confess I've not seen all our films, and probably never will. What about you, Danny?
Norman Stone, who was his colleague, did Shadowlands, the first one, without Anthony Hopkins, who was C.S. Lewis and Hannibal Lecter. So you really wonder how that fits when you're watching it. But Norman Stone really had a sense of the story and of character more than a message. And so he would let it move on. He also produced some of the very funniest and R-rated Christian cartoons done by Bob Godfrey, and showing some of the temptations. They're up in the library, and nobody has seen those, except for me over and over again.
I think Joe Costello saw one or two.
But they're delightful films, and so I looked at some of the British filmmakers, but I think Jim Fredericks, his Life of Paul, the Adventures of Paul, still holds up. It's a black and white film, but it has authenticity to it that are there.
Yes, Henry from 9
That's
to...
not a Christian film.
It's not a Christian film, but it's about his thought process while he was away. Very funny. Yes, another question.
Seems to me that the history of Christian film, and I speak as a novice here, but the history of Christian film is the history of learning how to do what Christians have done well for centuries, which is tell stories. And they really weren't very good at it in the beginning. And when you compare some of the stuff that we just saw on the wall to what the Regent students are doing and what our faculty are doing, there's just no comparison. Do you agree with that assessment that it's the process of learning how to tell stories in a way that is appropriate to the technology and the day?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that Regent was founded partly to have professionals making good Christian media, either television or film. And certainly, if you look at the early films we made back in the 80s, well, we got much better. But Terry takes credit for starting the film school.
So why weren't they better in the beginning? Why this didactic stuff?
Because they didn't know how to do it. They felt if they could preach, they could make a film. Wasn't true.
They don't even seem to have had a sense of story in so many cases.
Quite true. Carlos Batista was a
They
piano
were
salesman.
preachers. they came out of divinity schools. It's what they learned in seminaries. One thing that we did discover in the earlier book, and this one I have to thank my wife, Karen. She kind of endured me writing this for a long time. But in Sanctuary Cinema, I look at the two roots for Christian filmmaking, and I see them as the icon first. The icon because it's visual, and it draws you through to something else. And secondly, the theater. And the church had problems with both the icon and with the theater at times, but then in the Middle Ages, they used both of them to kind of communicate to the masses. And I think it takes different generations to learn how to articulate their stories. First, we emphasize the mind rather than the imagination. I think the imagination needs to be baptized and begin to express what images are there. I mean, as Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, he didn't start with a message. He started with an idea of a faun in a winter forest and a lamppost. And as he followed the images, the story came to him. And so it wasn't setting out to say, I'm going to tell a Christian allegory. No, that came in later. First, he followed the images. And we do not trust ourselves enough just to follow the images, knowing the Holy Spirit can take us both visually and verbally into things.
Yes, and of course, a large number of churches didn't want their membership to go to films, so people could grow up not seeing films, and I think you know lots about that.
You said there was a resurgence around the 1940s. I'm wondering, that was also around the time when television was starting to take hold in American living rooms. So I'm wondering if you had a negative reaction in this part of the culture to radio, I'm wondering what the effect of television was. And did you see any of that effect in the content or in the kind of practice of showing films here?
I think we did. I think one thing television did was made the conservative church audience realize visual communication might be okay. And so their problem then became not the movies themselves, but the theater. It's where you go. And so when they were able to bring the movies into the basement or other social halls, it was much more acceptable. But television helped, I think, acculturate the conservative fundamentalist churches to film.
This book goes up into about 1980, if I'm not mistaken. Why did you choose that as a date?
We got tired.
86, it ends. Originally, it was going to be one volume from the silent era to but that didn't work. So Terry wrote the silent era. Then this book covers up to 86. And at that point, the Christian industry, the 16mm Christian industry, collapsed for economic reasons. And then it was reborn in two ways. Some of our alumni, Danny Corrales for one, was somebody who boldly went on making films, but not on film, on video, and distributing directly to churches. His little company, DRG Productions, still survives. But other people said, just making films for churches is not reaching the wider audience. So films like Left Behind, and then most dramatically with Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, were made for wide-scale cinema audiences, and people still do that. Hence the enormous success of the Narnia films, and I would say the success of The Lord of the Rings and the whole Tolkien series. Very interesting films.
Andrew and I also have kind of logorrhea. It's kind of a diarrhea of words that comes out. And when we first turned up the first document, manuscript, to New York University publishers, they just said too many words. And so first thing I did, I took out all the middle initials, and it cut out thousands of words. It's just amazing. But then we discovered that we could divide this up into three areas. And Andrew's taking the last one. I started, we did the middle one together, and then he's going to take the box office Christianity on. And that deals with Walden, Passion of the Christ, and where others have gone to kind of make mainstream films with the Church of Atlanta and other places. The great thing we found out this last weekend, we were in Boston at a conference and went down to the Coop with Ben Fraser and Bill Brown, and the Harvard bookstore were there, and both of our books are there. It was really just wonderful to see them there in Harvard. Nobody was buying them, but they're there in Harvard, and we think that's great. So.
And what we like to think that there's a lot more research to be done, and I think a lot more research to be done on the 4th floor of the library, and I think quite soon we'll be starting the tours when you can go and actually see the racks and racks of film cans. So this is an area I think other people already are writing in it, but it was nice to be first.
Yes, it was. Thank you all for coming very much.